Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. It's really lovely to be back at CALRG. I did my PhD at the OU and finished in 2017. And during that time, I was one of the PhD organizers of the CALRG events in the research group. So it feels kind of full circle to come back and talk about some of my work since then. And it's really nice as well to see some familiar names and faces in our team's grouping there. But if we haven't met before, as Beck said, my name's Jenna Mittelmeier. I'm a senior lecturer in international education and I'm based at the University of Manchester. The University of Manchester is contextually very different from the OU when I was there and currently. It's one of the largest campus-based universities in the UK, although we kind of trade that title off with UCL each year in a bit of a rivalry. But my area of expertise centers around the internationalization of higher education broadly, and more specifically, I'm interested in the experiences and treatment of international students more specifically. So what I want to do today is to try to bring these multiple contexts that have been part of my career so far together and talk about considerations specifically for international students within online and digital spaces. As I talk today, I'm going to be drawing on a really wide range of work that I've done over the last 5 to 10 years. And I didn't really want to use the time necessarily to focus specifically on the specific studies and their methodologies. But instead, what I want to talk about is some of the common running themes through a lot of this work. And I raised this at the start because I think a lot of my work is really critical of narratives and discourses that are used about international students and used more broadly about internationalization, both in research and in practice. And oftentimes, I think I get these kind of knee-jerk reactions sometimes, which is to sort of express, this isn't how I feel, or this isn't what I see within my own department. So I just raised at the start that a lot of the critiques that I'm making are kind of rooted in evidence across a wide range of studies that I've been able to do with a collection of colleagues. And that includes work that we've done with lecturers across the UK about their internationalization practices, both in online and in face-to-face teaching settings. I've done a number of studies with international students in different international contexts about their experiences within higher education. And what I'm probably going to focus most of my talk today is about number 3, which is a set of systematic literature reviews that myself and colleagues have synthesized over 1,000 research articles about internationalization and international students, which I don't really recommend on a workload level, but has been really enlightening kind of on an intellectual level. I'll also talk a bit about some work that we've done analyzing internationalization strategies of all universities across the UK. So we've done some analysis led by my colleague Sylvie Lomer, where we analysed over 130 different internationalization strategies in British universities. And then finally, I'll draw less on the last bit, which is an analysis of Twitter data about public perceptions of international students. But I think kind of in putting all this forward, what has been really interesting about the work that I've been doing at the OU, but also since I left the OU, is how there are a number of different threads that are really common in the ways that international students are talked about, the ways that they're researched, and the ways that they're treated in higher education that have been common across all of these different studies, kind of despite the populations being very different and the aim of the research being very different. So some of these common threads that I really want to draw out today. So before I get too far into this, I thought that it's helpful for us all to kind of get on the same page in terms of what I'm referring to when I talk about internationalization. Many of the definitions about overarching internationalization are really vague. Purposefully so, I would say, primarily because internationalization represents a really wide range of practices at universities, and those practices can be really contextual. There's been a lot of work recently from different scholars trying to redefine or unpack how internationalization is defined. I won't go into much of that today, but I think one helpful framing is thinking about internationalization in kind of 3 broad categories, which is internationalization abroad, internationalization at home, and internationalization at a distance. So I'll talk through very briefly kind of what those 3 things mean. The first, what I would say is probably the most commonly discussed when we think about internationalization is internationalization abroad, and that's the movement of people and programs across borders. So that's where things like international students, staff mobility, the development of international branch campuses, study abroad provisions, those sort of things. So these mechanisms have really grown exponentially over the last few decades. There's now, for example, over 5 million international students who are geographically mobile for the purposes of education. That's not what I want to focus on today. The second bit, I think, internationalization at home is this recognition that mobility isn't feasible or possible or even desired for all students. So many institutions have begun developing international and intercultural learning opportunities for the benefit of students who are not geographically mobile. And that's often called internationalization at home. So that's things like curriculum internationalization, the inclusion of intercultural pedagogies, intercultural social opportunities, things that are happening in the informal curriculum, and things like that. And those two categories, which neither of those are what I'm focusing on today, those two categories, I'd say, are probably about 95% of the research on internationalization focuses on mobility and provisions within a home environment. But what I want to focus on today is the third aspect, and that is called internationalization at a distance. This is something we developed at the OU actually as part of the Ideas project that ran several years ago. Bart is here from the project. I'm not sure if anyone else is, but it was a collaboration with the University of South Africa, looking at international distance education. And what we were kind of noticing through that work was there were these really interesting third spaces, I've called them, that exist through the affordances of technologies, or various technologies really, where students are not geographically mobile. They remain within their home context or remain within their country of residence, but at the same time, they're having this experience which is not quite at home, because they're learning through an institution that's based in another country. So likely, not necessarily promised, but likely they're encountering different culturally valued pedagogies, cultural differences in curricula or framings of knowledge, and at least hopefully having some form of intercultural learning experience by nature of studying from a place located kind of beyond the culture of the individual. So we called this internationalization at a distance, defined it as this phenomenon where students and their institutions are geographically separated, but they're connected through technology. And I think the most obvious example of this is distance education, particularly because I'm talking at the OU. But I think it can be on a more micro level in kind of traditional face-to-face settings as well. So things like COIL, or collaborative online international learning, where classrooms are connected across borders for online group work activities. I think this has been an increasing phenomenon over the last few decades, but particularly I think the experience of COVID-19 and this shift to online learning that institutions like my own, who wasn't really thinking about online education and distance learning, but has now started to have these kind of conversations. I think there's increasing provisions of recognition of recruitment of international students who may not want or need to be geographically mobile. So I think this conceptualization brings up a number of questions, and that's what some of the work that I was doing recently. There was a handbook for online and digital education that was published this year that I was doing some work in about how do we define international students within these types of practices. So how do things like internationalization at a distance, how does that differ from other forms of internationalization in face-to-face campus or kind of campus-based settings? Or what specific considerations are there for international distance education compared to distance education within a domestic or home environment? But what I was trying to argue is I think one of the most rudimentary questions it brings up is how do you even define international students in the first place within these contexts? And that's partially because there's this entire field of research and practice which is really kind of predicated on students crossing borders. And theoretically, at least, distance education is borderless, and what is shifting is knowledge rather than people. Um, and one of the common, I think the problem with this is that one of the common ways we define international students is by mobility. So this is the definition you see on the screen that's from UNESCO in their Institute of Statistics. It's one of the key databases of international student mobility. They define international students as individuals who have physically crossed an international border between two countries with the objective to participate in educational activities in the country of destination. So kind of right from the offset, international distance education isn't covered by this because, of course, distance students are not crossing borders necessarily for the purposes of their education. The next commonly used approach is to define international students by visa. The migration data portal is one example of this, which is also a common database for international data about global students and international students. But they define international students specifically as those who typically hold a non-resident visa status, sometimes called a student's visa, to pursue a tertiary degree in the destination country. But again, this doesn't fit distance students because students in most countries, including the UK, are not eligible for a student visa if they're fully taking online or distance only courses. So again, this is another common definition that doesn't really fit the context of online and distance learning. So that brings us to the next commonly used definition, which is about the location from where students study. So HESA data in the UK, for example, collects data about what they call offshore students. So this is defined as all students studying wholly outside the UK who are either registered with a reporting UK higher education provider or studying for an award of the reporting provider. Kind of a mouthful. But really what this means is students who are located outside the UK. But again, this is a really poor proxy because the OU is a really good example of this, actually, where a sizable proportion of internationally located students are actually British citizens who are undertaking a degree back home. So this is a third definition, I think, that doesn't quite fit what we're trying to talk about. We're talking about internationalization in online distance learning. So what often happens is that defining international students becomes stuck in this awkward loop of defining them according to their kind of so-called otherness. So this is some of the responses when we were interviewing lecturers across the UK who taught on distance programs. We were asking them, how do you define international students within your settings? And we got a lot of kind of ums and ahs of not quite sharing, lecturers not quite sure how to make that definition. But we ended up after a bit of a pause, getting some of the examples that you see on the screen here. Kind of these discourses of not really being able to define international students, but relying on what I think are really problematic sort of us versus them or othering narratives of who international students are meant to be or represent, often kind of relying on unstated sort of ideas of so-called difference. So yeah, the examples you see on the screen are just a few, I think, illustrative examples of this. So one participant who referred to international students in distance learning as those who come from a different educational culture. And to me, this seems really vague. I'm not really sure how we define educational culture and how we set boundaries around that. But I think, for example, one could argue that Scotland has a very different educational culture compared to England, but we wouldn't necessarily call that international, depending who you ask. But the second example, I think, has the same sort of fallacies to it. So saying international students are those for whom English is not their first language. And again, I think this is problematic because there are many British citizens for whom English is not their first language, as the UK is a multicultural society with significant migration over recent decades. And I'm also not sure that Welsh speakers, for example, would take too kindly to that definition. So again, we get these kind of challenges of wanting to define, but also being unable to define who is who within these spaces. So I think one of the challenges of kind of research and practice in this area is that it's fuzzy and undefinable. So much of the work regarding internationalization is centered around these crossing of borders, where internationalization at a distance, at least again theoretically, is borderless, and the things that are mobile is knowledge and ideas rather than people. But at the other side, to pretend that intercultural differences don't exist is also really problematic, as there are these practical and contextual and pedagogical differences that occur when we're working in spaces where there's significant cultural diversity. And what I would argue is the way we define people matters, both morally, but also epistemologically and methodologically when we think about research. And a lot of research in this area leaves international students undefined and assumes that there's a shared meaning of who this population is. So I think one of the tensions that I'm really interested in kind of moving beyond is that assumed binary between home students and international students, and rethinking internationalness, however we want to define that, as perhaps a spectrum or even a spiral, and recognizing that there's really wide-ranging ways that people identify within this kind of space of being international. Again, however we want to make that definition. So I think when putting forward the question, how do we rethink international students in online and distance settings, I think there's first the problem of sheer definition, which to me feels really fundamental about knowledge creation in this area. But I think the second issue is thinking about kind of how do we move beyond labeling and definitions and start to rethink, or at least think more critically about practices with international students within these digital and online spaces. So that's kind of the second half of what I want to talk about today. Research with international students or about internationalization is a really huge interdisciplinary subfield. There's hundreds of articles that are published each year about internationalization. It's a subfield that also has a lot of challenges. The literature is really scattered. It's separated into disciplinary silos. That's something that we wrote about a lot in a book that we had published last week, which I'll show at the end. But I could talk quite a long time about the challenges I see within research in this area, but I won't bother everyone for the rest of the session about that. But I'm happy to talk more about it at the end if anyone's interested. But something that we wanted to do to kind of counter some of these limitations about research within this area is to pull together a series of systematic reviews about research regarding internationalization in higher education. This started when we were recruited by Advance HE to write a literature review about research published on the topic over the last 10 years. So that ended up being an analysis of about 650 papers. I'll show what that is in a second. We later expanded that though to over 900 papers that we synthesized and reviewed for a follow-up journal article. I guess because of some weird definition of fun, we thought that let's just keep adding to that number, or maybe because we're overachievers, I'm not really sure. Again, on a methodological level, it was an absolute nightmare, and I don't really recommend going forward with that if anyone is thinking about doing this kind of work. But I think intellectually it brought some really interesting themes and ideas. But we evaluated this really huge chunk of literature, and what we were looking for was to kind of try to find the common threads to get a sense of generally what works in internationalization. So thinking beyond the micro decisions and the contextual factors that lecturers are making within their classrooms, what are some of the overarching ethos or elements that makes internationalization meaningful in the evidence that exists. So we came up with kind of 5 things that are common across the literature. and I'll just briefly kind of share some of those. The first is this notion that internationalization should be purposeful. So it isn't enough to recruit a bunch of international students and throw in some international case studies and assume that's a meaningful intercultural experience. And there's plenty of evidence that shows us this is a really clear area that needs a rethink. And instead thinking about how there are efforts that are needed to take an embedded approach that purposefully integrates internationalization across the full spectrum of offerings with students. So thinking about internationalization of the curriculum and how that aligns with pedagogies, how that also is present within the assessments, where it exists within the intended learning outcomes, and also within the informal curriculum. So there's a lot of kind of assumptions within practice that the presence of international people equals an international experience. And we were able to kind of discern throughout the research that actually not embedding this and not being purposeful about it can actually do more harm than good in terms of confirming stereotypes or sort of failing to recognize the challenges that exist within an intercultural space. So that kind of brings us to the second bit, which is about how working in intercultural spaces is not innate, and that people bring with them the kind of biases and uncertainties that they have about one another. So an intercultural learning space is not value neutral. So if we want students to gain intercultural competencies or meaningfully learn to work with one another, then it has to be explicitly taught. For example, kind of throwing people together from different backgrounds into group work doesn't tend to go very well if it isn't purposefully taught how people should work together. And for example, what they might do when they inevitably encounter conflicting ideas or new ideas and values from peers from different backgrounds. And I would argue this becomes even more prominent in online learning, where there's additional barriers to those informal social connections that students develop. And by nature, the distance that exists between students can exacerbate some of these reliances on biases and stereotypes, or kind of exacerbate frustrations when working in intercultural spaces. The third was about the value of active learning, co-creation, and creative approaches to teaching. So what we found across the literature is that the vast majority of studies which identified some kind of impact on students' outcomes or experiences were thinking outside the box and beyond kind of didactic pedagogies. For online learning, I think this brings up a lot of questions about the role of synchronous activities or spaces for meaningful student collaboration. The fourth is about the importance of opportunities for reflection. So we recognize in the literature that students in intercultural spaces needed opportunities to reflect on how whatever they're learning about connects with their own identities and backgrounds and histories and experiences. So there were steps that were needed for teaching staff to make internationalized learning meaningful to students' own identities and their local contexts and future careers. So there's this intersection of internationalized and localized learning, and internationalization just for the sake of internationalization, or just by throwing in some case studies from other places without contextualizing them to students' own kind of values and histories, wasn't seen to be very meaningful. And then the fifth, and probably the most complex, is the way that learning in international and intercultural spaces means needing a recognition of the social conditions that underpin it. And again, I think this becomes even more important in online and distance spaces because the social conditions are kind of naturally more complex without the element of being kind of face-to-face in a space where you're sharing informal opportunities for communication and conversation. So working in an intercultural space kind of means by nature recognizing the existing inequalities, because by nature we work and we live in an unequal world, and students and staff are bringing with them, again, their biases and prejudices about one another. So this idea, again, that our classrooms are not value neutral, and there are significant differences in values and beliefs that exist within an intercultural space. But within our universities, kind of approaches for internationalization and approaches towards equality and diversity are often seen as separate processes. They're often in separate offices or by separate task forces within our institutions. I know I can't think of any institution that I've worked with throughout all this work that actually sees these as interlinked. Um, and I think that's really problematic because there's also, on the one hand, or on the other hand, really wide range of literature about the racialization that international students experience, for example, or the ways that internationalization, to be meaningful, also has to be anti-racist and anti-discrimination approach. Internationalization also kind of reflects the inequalities that are present within our world, and its processes are shaped by things like coloniality and colonial histories, which then intertwines issues of internationalization with decolonization, although again, these are often seen as distinct processes within institutions, and there's very limited reflection on their overlap. So I think bringing all this together, having looked through a lot of research on this area, what the evidence shows us is that meaningful intercultural experiences within universities need to be purposeful, and that they need to kind of engage explicitly with pedagogies that center internationalization as a process rather than just a content. So how does that align with what universities want to do with internationalization? Spoiler alert, it does not align at all. Some colleagues and I recently did a discourse analysis of all UK universities' publicly available institutional strategies for internationalization. And where a specific internationalization strategy didn't exist, we included the main university, wider university strategy to see where internationalization was mentioned. So that was over 130 different strategies we were looking at. So most of the kind of 160-ish universities that are present in the UK. Again, methodologically, not something I would advise, but it did come up with a number of really interesting threads. And I think one of the things that we found that was really glaring to us was how the vast majority of institutions across the UK center two things when it comes to internationalization. One is the recruitment of international students, perhaps unsurprising. And the second is the development of international research partnerships. And we found really hardly any examples of internationalization strategies which actually center curricula and pedagogies, despite all of that research evidence that I just talked about how internationalization isn't very meaningful without attention to those things. And I think similarly, the vast majority of UK universities are still focusing on mobility and about bringing students and people, staff, to the UK, with hardly any references to online and distance education. Although I think we saw kind of the development of greater online provisions start to creep in, and some of that language start to be present in some institutions. And I would imagine that's probably increased since we collected this data around 2021, and a lot of the new strategies have been developed kind of post-COVID. I would also say there's a number of strategies that actually don't mention internationalization or only mention it in passing, often kind of in reference to creating an international reputation, for example. The OU is one example of this. So at least within the OU's public-facing strategy, there's actually no mention of internationalization or international students. There are kind of a few vague mentions of developing an international role or conducting international research, but very limited or none at all mention of students. But the OU does have this really sizable international student population, and from kind of both insider and outsider perspective, I think there's space for a lot of growth in that area, but it doesn't seem to be a strategic focus, at least in reflecting on that in relation to curriculum and pedagogy. So let's bring this all back to online and digital research or digital education, and what does some of this evidence show us about what works specifically within these spaces. So kind of going back to the literature review that we did for Advance HE, which is available for free to read online on the Advance HE website if you just search my name. But the purpose of us doing this review is we specifically wanted to understand sort of whether and how internationalization has a demonstrable impact of literature on students' outcomes and experiences. So in our analysis of these kind of 650 or so articles, we were dividing the publications into 3 categories based on the level of impact on students that was presented within the research. So the first category was about demonstrable impact, and that's research designs which evaluated kind of within the research design whether different approaches to internationalization had a measurable impact on students, quantitative or qualitative, but we wanted to specifically see within the research design, was it looking at measuring its impact on students? So that tended to be things like pre-post designs or longitudinal studies that were evaluating different pedagogies or processes with students and how they impacted upon students by the end of the course. The second group was about research that reflected impact. So that was research where it was not built into the methodology about collecting or analyzing impact, but it was reflected on often in the conclusion or in the discussion about how this might have an impact on students. And then the final was limited impact, which was often kind of descriptive case studies, which have really interesting insights, but didn't specifically focus on students and how whatever pedagogy was being analyzed, how it impacted students. So across hundreds of articles that we included in the analysis, we found that about 13% of them focused on online and distance learning. That's sizable, but we might expect, particularly in the digital shift of recent decades, that we would expect a bit more than that. But I think what was really striking in evaluating these was kind of the limitations in terms of how few studies in these category of demonstrable impact centered the impact on students. So it means there's a lot of research on this topic, but not a lot of understanding about how well approaches to internationalization in online and digital education works. So, for example, within the research about distance learning, we found 25 studies published in the last 10 years about online distance learning and international students, and only 5 of them actually measured demonstrable impact of practices on students, broadly defined any kind of practice. There were more research that was conducted in areas such as online international partnerships, things like COIL, again, collaborative online international learning, thinking about things like online group work between classes in different countries, or the third category about the use of classroom technologies with international students. So a bit more evidence there, but really limited evidence in thinking about experiences and practices specifically with international students within online and distance learning spaces. Now, there's a lot more work in this area and work about international online distance education. But the work that we were specifically looking at was research in the last decade, which focused on how teaching and learning specific processes in internationalized settings impact students' outcomes and experiences. And despite this being a really prevalent research area, there's a really a lack of specificity in terms of analyzing evidence for what works using specific pedagogies in teaching and in international distance education. So I suppose that brings up a question of does this matter? Are there really that many differences for online and distance learning across borders? Is it really all that different from kind of the wealth of research that we have about internationalization and face-to-face settings? And I think emerging evidence tells us that yes, these are important questions for us to be asking. So one example, I wanted to give a shout out to the excellent work of one of my PhD supervisees, Diane Huang, whose PhD work is focusing on comparing the experiences within the same institution of international students who are geographically mobile and those who are studying through internationalization at a distance via an online program. And her work takes this really interesting lens of learning ecologies and looking at the differences and the ecological systems of these two groups of students. She's in her final year now, and she's done this really fascinating longitudinal study, kind of bringing in diaries and interviews with students as they go through a year of their education. And a lot of her findings are about these subtle ways that learning and students' surrounding ecologies differ in these forms of education. So kind of in particular, the ways that social and cultural learning opportunities are often missing from the learning experiences of students who are learning online, and how distance education often kind of fails to engage with issues surrounding intercultural difference, and that students themselves often don't center the internationalness of this international learning experience within their reflections of their experience. So I think there's a lot more space for research like this when we're rethinking practices. I think a very foundational need is for us to understand the ways that these experiences may differ. And there's space for a lot more research in this area, which kind of seeks to investigate some of the subtleties of experience across these different forms, and thinking more towards establishing greater understandings as a next step of what are some of the practices that have a measurable impact to bring in these international and intercultural elements into online distance education. So I think with that regard, some of the final things I wanted to bring up is to highlight that there are these really exciting and innovative practices that are happening within these spaces, kind of linking to the OU's Innovating Pedagogy reports. There's something really potentially valuable, I think, about the affordances of online and distance education to cross borders without geographic mobility. And there are these emerging practices, I think probably even more so kind of post-COVID, but practices like virtual fieldwork or field trips, being able to see an international place without having to go there, or the use of AI for translanguaging and translating approaches that allows people in different contexts to communicate with one another. One of my colleagues, Mark Carrigan, for instance, recently shared on Twitter this really fascinating video of him speaking about his research in German, even though he does not speak German, but he had used AI to translate and to match his voice to make it look like he could. Or there's other things like digital storytelling assessments, which offer these opportunities for centering reflections about intercultural learning in really creative ways. There are other areas that I think I hope continue to develop and kind of center international and intercultural issues within these online and distance spaces more moving forward. But again, I think we're in this space where there's a need for more evidence and more recognition within the research of what actually makes a demonstrable impact within these spaces. So that brings me to a few final things, if any of this was of interest. We do have a special issue that's coming up in BJET, and the call for papers should come out soon. But this is a special issue about internationalization at a distance and thinking about some of these critical reflections within digital shifts in international higher education and how these two spaces can start to learn from one another, and also critiquing areas where there are existing inequalities within international and online distance learning. I mentioned that we have a book, which is something I'm really, really proud of, that came out, I guess 2 weeks ago now. So it's called Research with International Students, Critical, Conceptual, and Methodological Considerations. It's a book that we wrote particularly with researchers in mind who are doing research that includes international students as participants or co-researchers. So thinking through some of the kind of critical ideas that are necessary when conducting research within intercultural spaces. It is open access, so available on the Routledge website if anyone has an interest in reading. And then the final thing I wanted to say before I hand over, because I'm interested in your kind of comments and questions, is I lead an internationalization practitioner network. So this is kind of an informal network of staff around the world who have some form of connection to internationalization within their work. Some of those are lecturers, There's a lot of professional services staff within it. Institutional leadership members are part of that network as well. And what we do is we have a monthly online discussion. It's really conversation based around critical questions about internationalization. Our next session is next week, November 21st, which is thinking about inequalities in internationalization, led by my colleague Sylvie. But we have a different speaker every month who speaks for about 10 minutes, and then we use the rest of the time for conversation. So if anyone is working in this area who wants to share their work as well, that's an open space to be able to do so. I think that's all I had to say. I think, kind of in summary, just this I think there's a lack of recognition of internationalness within online and distance research, and within some of the practices that are done with international students, however we want to define them. And I think there's a need to rethink the purposefulness of internationalization and the reasons why we do it, and what value we think it brings to students. But I think with that, I'm really happy to hand over to colleagues and hear your thoughts and questions on that.